Lisa, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. Yet another murder of a woman on Women's Month. Allow me to do this. Now, in August, just to recap, of 2020, Uyinene Mkhwetyana, a 19-year-old University of Cape Town student, was brutally killed. Nationwide protests ensued. The brutal murder of the fourth-year law student Nosicelo Mtebeni a year later, during Women's Month, yet again. Not forgetting Tsegofatso Pule, Naledi Pangindawo, Nompumelelo Chaka, Nomfazi Gabata, Nwabisa Nkwandela, Alticia Kortje, and Lindelwa Beni. The list goes on, Lisa. Are we failing our women?
You know, murder is a very difficult thing to prevent. It really is. And one can understand the terrible fear and anxiety that a murder like Nosicelo's provokes, because it is a horrible and brutal murder. But murder is not something you can prevent by holding a protest, by issuing messages on social media, and by being outraged. It's a complex problem that requires a range of different kinds of interventions. And unfortunately, we're not approaching this in a complex way. We keep on trying to deal with it in very simplistic ways by thinking if we protest and say to men, stop it, behave, that that's going to be enough. And I'm afraid it isn't. And your Men's Empowerment Network speaker was already starting to allude to some of the many other things that will need to happen to reduce violence, like focusing on children, abusive and neglectful circumstances that children grow up in, boys' exposure to violence. Those are not quick fixes, and they're not things you deal with through protests.
And you're absolutely right about looking at it in a very simplistic approach. But there were measures, that one would have assumed would have targeted the complexity of it. And some of these measures were, announced following the president's address in Sona. How are we faring as a country, given that, on paper, there are measures that are supposed to be curbing some of these cases that we are seeing today?
Those measures certainly didn't go far enough. And I think, again, another mistake we keep on lapsing to in South Africa is to look to the criminal justice system, is to think that if we just introduce harsher bail conditions and we introduce heavier sentences, that that's going to be the magic bullet that is a deterrent. No, there's no evidence of that. We've had minimum sentences in place since 1997. I think what we should be doing is looking at research that has tried to understand what is it that does work with men, and also what is it that doesn't work. And I think what is quite concerning is that one very good study that was undertaken in Diepsloot suggested that if you're not careful in how you run programs with men, you can actually make the problem worse. You can actually end up making already violent men more violent. So that's another call to us to step back and think carefully about what we're doing. I mean, I think what was very important about that research is that it suggested that, in addition to looking at things like highly disruptive and adverse childhood circumstances, which I think it puts some of these men into a position where they seem to be suffering from, scored very highly in terms of depression and anxiety. There were also men who came from circumstances where they hadn't been eating regularly and they weren't working. So, there's that whole dimension that's also got to be looked at in terms of how we address violence. We've also got to look at the fact that, many men still consider themselves or find their sense of being a man through having a job. And if you look at what's happened in South Africa recently, and the way the economy has been affected, it certainly had a harsher effect on women, but it's also had a harsher effect on men. And as long as we tie masculinity to things like having a job and being in charge, when that doesn't happen for men, they may respond violently as a way of creating an alternative sense of trying to earn respect and be seen as a man to be feared and taken seriously.
Now, it's very interesting what you say about just being careful about the conversation around discussions that you have around dangerous men, because they might tend to become more dangerous. I mean, this very incident, this case that we are discussing today, was very violent in nature. And it becomes very interesting then if we had to follow what the study is saying, we bring the conversation back into children and childhood. Many parents can't even talk about sexual relations and education with children. I mean, just the other day, we heard staggering statistics about 23,000 school-going children, teenagers, some young as 10 years old, being pregnant, in the past financial year. How do we bring that conversation to school going age? And also, how do we bring communities into the fray and actually hold them accountable to the discussions and the conversations?
That's such an important question, Unati, because I think one of the difficulties that we grapple with is that South Africa is a country that is both very progressive in some respects, but at the same time also very socially conservative. So we sometimes have a constitution, for instance, that is ahead of how many parents in particular are. They are not comfortable with talking about sexuality. Many, I think, are still in the position where they discipline their children using violence and corporal punishments. And so when you come along telling them things like, don't hit your children, but we're not giving them any alternatives around how you discipline children, I think that leaves parents in a very uncomfortable position. We tell them what not to do, but we don't give them tools and skills and information around how to do things differently. And I mean, we can see just last year the outcry that happened over the proposed new curriculum that would have taken a much more expansive understanding and approach to sexuality, how much objection there was to that. And I think here's where one needs to bring the churches in, because they're sometimes at the forefront of trying to prevent greater openness and more egalitarian discussions around sexuality. And they're often the ones who want to lead and support things like disciplining children harshly. So I think we've also got to be bringing them in to think about how we do things differently.
How do we bring the conversation, especially around this particular case? I mean, I was listening to what the mayor in East London was saying, just around what women should be doing, as opposed to what men shouldn't be doing. How do we bring the case around objectification of women? I mean, it's very clear in this latest incident that, this was a brazen attack on an innocent woman, and it would seem that this man, or at least the suspect in this case, saw his victim as an object of his.
That's very common, I think, in a great many of intimate femicides, is there is a sense that you are mine, you are my possession. And so you see quite a lot of these murders sometimes being precipitated when women have the nerve, as their partners see it, to express a different point of view and to not be objects, to actually be different human beings with different desires and wishes and thoughts. And I think for some men, if they don't understand that they're dealing with another human being, but just think of it as an object, that can be so enraging that one way they do sometimes respond is to behave violently, because how dare my object speak back to me? You also see it, I think, in some of the incredible possessiveness that men show. And a great many of these murders are prompted by a sense of possessiveness. You mustn't look at another man, you mustn't talk to another man, you must constantly be paying attention to me, and you must never ever leave me unless I say you must go. So I mean, all those things, that inability to see women as separate human beings who have different ideas and different opinions lies at some of the core of the problem, because I think when men suddenly discover that this woman is not a fantasy object, but a real person, they tend to respond quite violently and with great disappointment in that you're not who I thought you were. You are being dishonest with me. Whereas, I mean, she's a real person. He was never seeing who she really was.
A real person who could have been a lawyer and now has lost her life. Lisa, thank you so much for your time. Always a pleasure speaking to you, albeit in a very difficult situation. Thank you so much. Lisa Vetten there is a gender activist and researcher.